Well, welcome. My name's Liz McGill. I'm the Dean of the Law School, and I'm just delighted to see all of you here at the Law School. As you know, we are here for the 48th Annual Carlos Kelly McClatchy Memorial Symposium. Thanks for coming. I especially want to thank our travelers from DC who have come a long way to be with us today to talk about their book, which is quite exciting. It's a slightly pessimistic title, I have to say. It's even worse than it looks. How the American constitutional system collided with the new politics of extremism. It is interesting, I think, and appropriate that this book is the focus of the symposium because the McClatchy family, of course, has spent much of its life over time in the newspaper business working for good government. So to the extent that that is part of our topic today, it's certainly appropriate for the symposium. I think it would honor the McClatchy family and maybe make us a little bit less depressed if we manage to find a ray of hope by the end of the symposium today. So let's see if we can do that. I also can't resist recognizing Nate Persily, who is the James McClatchy Professor of Law. He's here to moderate the symposium. The symposium, of course, is named for James McClatchy's father, Carlos. So we have a lot of McClatchy recognition today. It's hard to believe that this is Nate's first year on the faculty. He came to us from Columbia. A few months ago, we had an amazing faculty workshop on the report of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration that Ben Ginsberg, who is also on the panel today, and Bob Bauer co-chaired. They were there to discuss that report with Nate and the rest of the faculty. So the theme of that conversation and that report was bipartisan cooperation, which is a hopeful possibility, at least in the election administration realm. So maybe Nate and Ben will share their positive ray of hope possibility with Tom and Norm and the rest of us. So it's terrific for the law school to be able to physically host us today. And again, I appreciate all of you coming, and let's look for a ray of hope. I'm going to turn it over to Jim Fishkin, chair of the communication department, who's going to say a few words.
Great. Thank you so much. So I want to thank Susan McClatchy. I think she might be here somewhere. She's not here yet. Well, she's coming. So I want to say, as Liz noted, this is the 48th annual Carlos Kelly McClatchy Symposium. McClatchy Fellows have a very long history here. I was looking over the list. They include people like R.W. Apple, Tom Wicker, John Chancellor, Walter Cronkite. I wonder what if we could conjure them into existence again, what they would think of the U.S. Congress now, what they would think of the picture depicted in the book, which is a contested picture, as we will find out, and we're going to deliberate about the accuracy of that picture. But what they would think about it is it just, and I would note that we've often had, or sometimes had, partisan polarization, even extreme partisan polarization. In 1858, soon before the Civil War, there was actually a brawl on the floor of the House involving 30 members about slavery issues. And this is just on the verge of the Civil War. And it only ended when one of the members in the fight lost his hairpiece, and the entire chamber erupted in laughter. But
Trump.
but we all know what followed, and it wasn't laughter. Now, we don't expect our political parties, no matter how polarized, to engage in warfare. They may be a little bit of cyber warfare, maybe some dirty tricks, maybe some Watergate-style burglaries, maybe even a partisan-motivated, this is speculative, bridge closing somewhere. But we don't expect any actual warfare. Nevertheless, The real question is whether the current tribalism is undermining the problem-solving and deliberative capacities of our most important representative institution. And if so, is there some way out of this mess? What is some song, somewhere out of here, some way out of here, I think. So I turn this over to Nate Persily, who's going to lead our panel in this issue.
Thank you. I think this mic is on, so you can probably hear me from this. So let me put this will be for questions later on.
Yeah.
I rarely need one mic, let alone two. So, let me thank all of you for coming to this event. It's such a thrill to see so many people here. And I will, when Susan McClatchy comes, I will thank her as well. And so consider it, at least for purposes of posterity on the tape, she knows that I thanked her at the beginning. And we have water. Now, you'll only get this if you compromise.
I brought my own.
You can bring a pundit to water, but, you know.
I'll take that.
We have the authors of this book, Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein, have been touring around Stanford all day, giving talks at various classes. So I'm particularly thankful to you two for the last 4 hours and the impending hour and a half or so that you'll continue talking about your book. The way we'll proceed is that they will talk for about 10 minutes each or so, and then we'll have a discussion with responses by Jane Schacter and Ben Ginsberg. All of these people need no introduction, but then you always have to introduce them afterwards. And so let me just say a few words about Tom and Norm, which is that Tom Mann is of the Brookings Institution. Norm Ornstein is from the American Enterprise Institute. I think the way I often introduce them is say, well, they're probably the number one, you can decide which one is number one Washington observers of American politics, right? When you think of people who comment on American politics from inside the Beltway, they are the resident political scientists in Washington, D.C. So it's been that way for generations, and those of us who are political scientists are thankful that they are there to offer their insight as trained political scientists, both in the media and to policymakers. Commenting on the book will be Jane Schacter, the William Cromwell Professor of Law here at Stanford, an expert on constitutional law, legislation, the initiative process, and so many other areas of the law. And following her will be Ben Ginsberg, my former boss and co-teacher. As Liz mentioned, he was the co-chair of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, but long before that, he was the lawyer who was general counsel for the Romney for President campaign, George W. Bush for President campaign, RNC, RSCC, any other kind of alphabet soup of names starting with an R. He's been the lawyer for them. And so we want to hear from you toward the end, so we want to have more of a discussion than merely a lecture, but I want to just start off with having Tom and Norm introduce the book.
Thanks, Nate. For both of us, we're just delighted to be here and to have such a nice crowd. Jim sort of took a slap at Chris Christie, and I want to speak up for him. He was just trying to bring all the people of New Jersey together. Of course, he tried to do it by pushing them all into one lane. It may not have been the best way to go. This is a pretty tough time in American politics. We've been through an especially rough year. It's been a tough year for President Obama. The other night on television, I saw Jimmy Carter comparing him to Jimmy Carter. Talk of a new reality show, Lame Duck Dynasty. But an even worse year for Congress. We just had another indictment, Michael Grimm of New York, but probably the low point was Trey Raydell of Florida, busted on cocaine charges. He pled guilty. The judge sentenced him to 4 years as mayor of Toronto. Poor Rob Ford, who's somewhere in this area, I think, doing rehab, now is not running for re-election. He says he's very disappointed. He wanted to take another crack at it.
It's like the Catskills.
Tumblr is the word. We like to get you laughing because it's all downhill from this point on. So, in just a brief period of time, we can't even really give you the bones of a description of the book. Let me start by just saying a few things. First, Tom and I have been in Washington now for a little more than 45 years, immersed in our politics from one end of Pennsylvania Avenue to the other, and we actually started in the public opinion world as well. And we've never seen it this dysfunctional. And we've been through plenty of periods of dysfunction. We came to Washington when the Vietnam War just created a division in the society and in our political process right down the middle. We went through 2 impeachments and plenty of things. We titled the book very deliberately, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, because it never looks good. It's not supposed to look good. Democracy is messy. Resolving differences with people who have very different backgrounds, very different viewpoints, very different interests is a difficult thing to do. The old saw, never watch laws or sausages being made, it has resonance, although I must offer a caveat. A friend of mine in Iowa did a tour of the Hormel factory a few weeks ago and called me and said it's much cleaner than the political process. And anything in Washington right now. But this is worse. Now, what makes it worse? And I should note that Tom and I came together to Washington. We have been collaborating together on things for the better part of 40 years. We care for the institutions. We did not want to become partisan actors or get involved in ideological warfare. Much of what we've written has, it's all called it as we've seen it, and it's hit both parties. We've written books in the past. The previous one before this was called The Broken Branch, How Congress is Failing America and How to Get It Back on Track. This one is gloomier because of the reality that we see. Now, why? It starts, of course, with what we all know, the sharp polarization, ideological and partisan, that has been building for some time. But it's really important to emphasize that polarization alone does not bring deep dysfunction. A few weeks ago, after the announcement by Henry Waxman that he was retiring from the House, I wrote a column on it, and I was reflecting back 40 years in the House, and you look at the policies that Henry has impacted, has had his fingerprints all over, and they are probably as sweeping as any lawmaker in the 20th century. But this is not some moderate who tried to pull a centrist coalition together. Henry is over at the left end of the spectrum, but he's a problem solver. And he will tell you that his proudest moments have came during the Reagan administration, when he was able to expand Medicaid, protect Medicare, do a whole host of other things, because he found some seams in the process, had a little bit of leverage. Every piece of legislation, healthcare, environmental, whatever it may be, with the exception of the Affordable Care Act, that he was deeply involved in, had 100 or more Republican co-sponsors in the House. So he was, in many ways, a polarizing figure. You look at Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch at ends of the spectrum for much of their time, but their friendship and their willingness and desire to solve problems created the Children's Health Insurance Program and a panoply of other areas. So you can be polarized and still solve problems. This is different. And to us, the root of the dysfunction now is something much more akin to tribalism. Tribalism is where you, in effect, say, if you're for it, I'm against it, even if I was for it yesterday. And I'll just quickly mention one prime example that we use in the book. In early 2009, we had a commendable effort at problem-solving bipartisanship. Conservative Republican Senator Judd Gregg joins together with moderate Democratic Senator Kent Conrad, and they propose a commission that would have the imprimatur of being passed through both houses of Congress, signed by the president, and some clout to deal with our long-term debt problem. Simple majority on the commission, not a supermajority, come up with a recommendation, however sweeping, and it would get expedited votes in the House and Senate. And there almost literally wasn't a day in 2009 and through into 2010 when Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader of the Senate, didn't take to the floor, go on a radio or television program or give a speech and say, we can solve this problem, we can deal with this problem if we just had the Greg Conrad Commission. The Greg Conrad Commission is the way to go if only President Obama would get behind us and join us in this venture. And then in early 2010, Barack Obama endorsed the Greg Conrad Commission. Just a few weeks later, it came up for a vote in the Senate. It got 53 of the 100 senators supporting it. Filibustered, 7 votes short of what it needed. 7 original Republican co-sponsors of the Greg Conrad Commission and Mitch McConnell supported the filibuster and killed the bill. Now, if Ben or anybody else can give me an explanation other than, if you're for it, I'm against it, even though I literally was for it yesterday, and it didn't change. It's not like I voted for it before I voted against it. Then I'd be delighted to hear it. I've tried for 4 years to find one, and I haven't. And that's only one of many examples that we have of that. It's a reflection now of a couple of things. I'll just mention 2 quick things that are important to remember. One is, this is a reflection of a ruthlessly pragmatic attitude that is rooted in the permanent campaign. Everything in the political arena now gets focused through the lens of the campaign. There's no season of campaigning followed by a season of governing. No season of campaigning, which is a zero-sum game. There's a winner and a loser. You take no prisoners. You don't want to win barely. You want to grind your opponent into the dust so that he or she will never arise again, and nobody else will want to take on the task of running against you the next time. But governing in the American political system is an additive process. People are your adversaries, not your enemy, because your adversary one day can be your ally the next. Now it's all campaigning all the time, driven in part by the polarization and the fact that for the last 20 years, every election you can plausibly see a way in which the majority could shift. So the stakes are much higher, and if you work with somebody on the other side, pragmatically that may give them legitimacy, traction, popularity, and it may reduce your chances of moving into the majority, and you have a very different agenda. Nobody embodies that more than some of the things that Mitch McConnell has said. This is a mindset that hits both parties. But for McConnell, it started with, my number one goal is to make Barack Obama a one-term president. When Mitch first said it, I thought, well, he's been misquoted or he misspoke. He meant to say, my number one goal is to get the economy moving again and to accomplish that goal, maybe. But he didn't. He cut right to the chase. And then after the midterm elections, he said, well, of course we weren't going to work with those Democrats or the president, because if we had and those policies had passed, they would have been given the patina of bipartisanship. They were popular. He would have gained. We would have lost. That is a ruthlessly pragmatic way of looking at how you solve problems. And then you add into it another factor which makes this whole task for us so much more complicated, which is a more deeply visceral one, a cultural one, the tribal one, which is you are the enemy. And it is, if you're for it, we're against it just because you're for it. And that goes deeper and isn't just pragmatic. And now both parties actually face a task in trying to transcend all of that. But it also means that our task in moving beyond this to create a different level of function and functionality in the political arena, to keep the tribalism, which is already metastasized from elites in Washington to so many states and to a very considerable degree to the public as a whole, from growing further into a kind of sectarian difference, becomes much harder because structural solutions don't easily resolve problems that are more deeply rooted in both a ruthlessly pragmatic, strategic view of how you treat the world and a more deeply visceral attitude towards others in your society.
Put Norm down as neutral on these matters, okay? Now let me give you the really bad news. Nate and Jim, thank you so much for inviting us. I've been to Stanford on numerous occasions. This is really a special visit, and I'm delighted to be here with you. Ben, I want you to know that I wrote a really favorable blog on your Commission on Election Reform when it came out. So you might keep that in mind when you proceed to eviscerate our book in a few minutes. I'm not ashamed of bribing, you know.
Is this quid pro quo?
Clearly the appearance.
Norm has given you a good feel for the book. I want to get to hear your reactions and to get a discussion going. So I want to simply make 2 points. One is underlying. First, Jim Fishkin used the term warfare and how it really wasn't. It really is appropriate. Now, the permanent campaign doesn't begin to capture the nature of the warfare that the two parties engage in right now. And it's so important to have in mind, for scholars of Congress, it's not helpful to rely on the individual members as the unit of analysis and start thinking about the incentives and the median voter. It doesn't begin to capture the kind of dynamics of genuine warfare with the stakes high because of the ideological differences and because of the distinctiveness of the policy demands made by the members and networks of each of the party, but also because as Francis Lee and others have demonstrated, the high level of competitiveness for control of the White House and Congress fuels this kind of strategic behavior and works very much against the whole notion of deliberation. What we have, my first point, is a fundamental mismatch between the kind of political parties that have developed over the last couple of decades, and it's been decades in making, highly ideologically polarized, vehemently oppositional, internally unified, distinctive from one another. In other words, parliamentary-like parties. Those parties set in our constitutional system. We finally got responsible parties, but Austin Ranney, a great friend and political scientist, issued a dissent from the floor in the American Political Science Review the year the 1950 APSA report toward a more responsible party system was issued. And Austin was sort of very clear about the consequences of having responsible parties in the American constitutional system. He argued that indeed the mixture is a formula for willful obstruction and policy irresolution. More ideologically coherent, internally unified, and adversarial parties in the fashion of Westminster-style parliamentary democracy would be a disaster within the American constitutional system, given our separation of powers, separately elected institutions, and constraints on majority rule that favor cross-party coalitions and compromise. Divided, we no longer govern. It simply is impossible under these partisan conditions to expect any kind of possibility of genuine negotiations between opposing parties and a president Congress divided by party. All of the talk of presidential leadership and not compromising, reaching out is nonsense and irrelevant. The second point that really was a strong motivation for us to write this book was what we saw as a professional discomfort with this system among ourselves, political scientists, scholars, media types, university faculty member who teach American democracy. It was hard. Our instincts as scholars and historians are to say we've seen it all before. Nothing new under the sun. We've been there. We'll get out of this. Another thing is, this is simply elite betrayal of a moderate, centrist, pragmatic setter in the American public. And once we shape up the elites, everything will be fine. The public is not polarized, therefore America is not polarized. And another, of course, one of the arguments of the book is that the partisan polarization in the modern era has evolved as one that is deeply asymmetric. It's one in which the Republican Party, as we say in the book, has become the insurgent outlier, ideologically extreme, contemptuous of the inherited policy regime, going back to Roosevelt, and by that I mean Theodore Roosevelt, scornful of compromise, unpersuaded by conventional understandings of facts, evidence, and science, and dismissive of the legitimacy of their political opposition. We thought we dealt with that latter in the election of 1800, the acceptance of the other team that comes in to rule on winning an election, but it's not part of the zeitgeist of the Republican Party. That's very awkward to say without seeming to be partisan. But the fact is, and some of you sort of may believe that's why we're saying it, but there is an overwhelming body of evidence now accumulated which measures the behavior of elected officials in Congress and state legislatures, which also goes to the level of the public, which has not led this, but certainly become implicated in what was the most polarized election in terms of voting patterns by party that we have seen in contemporary history. These are all sort of difficult things. It's difficult for the mainstream media to cover this. They're both implicated. It's all the same. We argue and we believe there is support, and we haven't seen anyone yet produce evidence that refutes that body of research, other than to say, oh well, they're both implicated. Come on. We have to be in this together. It's impolite. You'll make members of your audience or public who are Republicans feel badly. Well, there are a lot of Republicans who feel badly that we're very happy to see our book and what was said, because they believe that has happened to their party, and from their point of view, it's unfortunate. We see it happening so much in the press that we thought it was worth just being blunt and outspoken about it. It's not just the asymmetric polarization; it's the mismatch. It is the affective polarization between the parties, as scholars called it, and Norm called it tribalism. That is real. It is the match between ideology and party. As a young scholar, new scholar, originally from UCLA, Hans Noel has said, is almost a perfect fit, more so than any other time in history. There are huge differences, and we thought it important to point it out. And if we're wrong, tell us. I'm sure Ben will.
Jane Schacter.
Thank you, and thank you so much for coming. This is a real treat to be on a panel with all of you. So I found the book very compelling, very sobering, and very depressing. I am not going to be the ray of hope. I don't know if Ben is going to be the ray of hope. Somewhat improbable, but perhaps. You can't win on this panel. You can't win on this.
You're kidding.
So I don't want to get into the attributions of responsibility. I'm certain that Ben will have a word or two about that. But I think the book paints a very stark and compelling picture. But here's the dilemma for me. The same factors that produce the magnitude of the problem make it hard for Congress or the political process to solve the problem. So it's really hard to find the ray of hope because of that. So I started thinking, are there institutions external to Congress, external to the political branches in Washington that might be able to play a constructive role here? Spoiler alert for those of you who want to be in suspense for the next 5 minutes, I don't think so. But I looked, I thought, I tried. So the two I thought about are the press and journalists, and they certainly come in for withering criticism in the book, but I want to say a few more words about that. And the other law professor is courts. Is there a role for the courts here? And I want to say a few words about that. So in terms of the press, could we imagine a kind of chastened, newly courageous press that really takes seriously its role to kind of facilitate democratic debate in our society, ready to call out obstructionist tactics, ready to call out, for example, one of the things the book talks about is journalists don't remark on the fact that the filibuster has become an everyday fact of life in Congress. And so there's really not much information flowing to people, or not enough critical information flowing to people about how extraordinary and how disruptive the filibuster is. It seems to me like an improbable time to cast newspapers and the political press and journalists as the heroes here. Newspapers, of course, are shrinking before our eyes. Newsrooms are continuing to fire people. Sources of news are multiplying. And so the old institutional press had more of a monopoly maybe than the kind of dispersed digital press has. I think in particular we ignore at our peril what's going on the internet, where lots and lots, and here's where the phenomenon of tribalism I think really comes into play, where lots of people get their news from social networks. So something like 2/3 of US adults are on Facebook, and about half those people get news from Facebook. That means they're getting it from their Facebook friends, who probably see the world roughly the way they do. There was a study a couple of years ago about Twitter, and it studied political tweets and links to political news. And it showed that overwhelming majorities of Republican or Democratic tweeters, if that's the right word, respectively, tweeted stories to with their partisan tilt, to people with similar views. This is kind of reminds me of kind of Fox and MSNBC on the internet. So it's hard to break through that with kind of neutral information that's going to shake up the way people see things. You might remember the book, 6 or 8 years ago by Cass Sunstein about information cocoons. I think it was called Infotopia. So I worry about that. I mean, the internet simultaneously reduces the cost of information and allows us to get information in a much more dispersed way more quickly to people, but it seems to further some of the very patterns that support the tribalism that's discussed in the book. Well, how about the courts, the other branch of the federal government? At least at the level of theory, we could pretty well sketch out the justification for courts to get interested in the kind of democratic dysfunction that's chronicled in the book, right? We don't have to go much further than the former dean of Stanford Law School, John Hart Ely, in his classic book, Democracy and Distrust, where he isolates what he regarded as two prime democratic malfunctions. One, incumbents trying to choke off the channels of change, he said, by holding on to their position and keeping challengers out. And the other was majorities disadvantaging minorities because they see things through the distorting lens of prejudice. So either by kind of stretching those categories or by adding a new one, we could say that it might rightly be the role of courts to try to protect our democratic institutions as they interpret the Constitution and interpret statutes with the crippling effects of what's described in the book in mind. I don't want to get into the weeds of legal doctrine on any of this, but we could easily think of some examples. Expand the definition of political corruption that's used in the context of campaign finance reform to uphold more limits on campaign contributions and even expenditures. That is, repudiate the existing framework and some existing doctrine and move more expansively. A second idea would be for the court to be much more aggressive in addressing partisan gerrymandering. Right, the test that's been used when claims are even justiciable is almost impossible to satisfy. A third thing, to take a case that's before the court this term, interpret the recess appointments clause before the court in the Noel Cannon case in a way that allows recess appointments as a safety valve in the face of long-term obstructionism. And then the last one is the least plausible. I think it's basically a non-starter in the courts, but an interesting one to think about. I mean, there's a big literature now about whether the filibuster is unconstitutional or not. And in fact, there was a case decided not that long ago by the D.C. Circuit holding that there was no basis to litigate that claim. That is, that it's a political question, that nobody has standing to raise it, and you do have to do some acrobatics to figure out who might be a plaintiff who could actually challenge the constitutionality of the filibuster. But I say that not to say, yeah, that's a good winning argument, but to say we could easily imagine a court, and we have a court now that's willing to walk away from longstanding doctrine in many areas. We could easily imagine a court that decided to revisit some of these issues. But here's the rub of this. And it goes beyond saying this court is not inclined in that direction. You might have seen a couple of weeks ago in the newspaper, Adam Liptak did a story, and he based it on a paper that's just come out by Neil Devins and Lawrence Baum. It's a really nice paper. It talks about the increasing partisanship and hyper-partisanship on the Supreme Court. And they've got some really interesting data in there. The thing that I'll just give you one example. The thing that stuck out to me is we're used to kind of 5-4 votes in highly controversial cases with justices appointed by the same party sticking together. In many cases, not all cases, we know that Justice Kennedy is a swing voter, but in many cases, they stick together by party. Voting rights, campaign finance, arbitration, to name a few areas of controversy. And what they reported is they took a kind of a pretty neutral reference work on the Supreme Court, which has a long appendix of significant cases. And you could quibble at the edges about what's in and what's not on the list, but it's not a particularly controversial list. So of the 71 cases from 1790 to 1937, that's a long time, deemed important by this standard reference work, and in which there was at least 2 dissenting votes, only 1 broke by party affiliation. And that is, now we see that as a quite routine event. So the problem is, I think, to go back to the image of tribalism, the problem is the tribalism shows up in all kinds of places, including those places where we might look for a remedy. That is, it's not a problem just in Congress, it's a much bigger problem. Hence, I have no ray of hope.
Now for Mr. Sunshine himself.
Wonderful to be with you. I do love these sessions where I get to answer for every sin, real and perceived, of Republicans. It is great to be here at a McClatchy lecture. Actually, I was a newspaper reporter for 5 years between college and law school, never on a McClatchy paper, but I've certainly admired the papers that they've run, and it's a nice symbolism. And it's also great to be back at Stanford. The quarter that I spent here teaching with Nate was really a terrific experience because although I would not say conservative thought predominated here at the Stanford Law School, the conversations were really all civil, and I found them tremendously useful because everyone sort of respected the motives and viewpoints of the different people who we're talking to. And so that's a really great thing. And I want you to know that despite anything I may say, I really do like these guys. and look forward to this. Look, it's important, I think, to recognize that there is more than one viewpoint about any debate, including debates that seem dysfunctional at any one point in time. And if you do want to solve issues of polarization and dysfunction, I think a productive place to start is not impugning the motives and questioning the judgment of the people who you say are the problem. How you come together in that realm, I'm just never quite sure. And that's what I find, I agree with a lot of the factual analysis that they have in the book. But more than anything else, it's the sort of impugning of the motives of your enemies that I think gets you to a nasty place. But I always do think it's important in discussions to understand who you're talking to. So I hope you'll indulge me in a little bit of a poll. First of all, how many of you vote in California? If you could just raise hands. Anybody anyplace else, or all Californians? Just shout out some names of them.
New York. Utah. Massachusetts.
Ah, truly a national audience. Okay, how many of you voted for George H.W. Bush 41? Okay, and how about Bob Dole? Some of you get an excuse on age. And George W. Bush 43? And John McCain. Not even you two, wow. And Mitt Romney in either of his chances. All right, so as we go through this discussion, let's just, that was very useful. And thank you. And I just want to say it's great to be back among the base again.
Wait, Ben, did you vote for John McCain?
Yeah, I did.
How many didn't vote who could have voted?
That's a good question, too. How many didn't vote who could have voted?
For which election?
Any of them. So we have a political... Fewer people didn't vote than voted Republican. Okay. So I want to approach this from my experience, which, number one, is being a hard-edged partisan who has gone at Democrats from a Republican perspective for a lot of years and being proud of it and not shrinking away from that. And secondly, from the really rewarding experiences that Nate and I had in this past year as co-chairing the Presidential Commission on Election Administration, which did agree on a whole set of unanimous recommendations for a series of problems in the running of our elections. And we were able to come to agreement for that. And there are some lessons, Liz's ray of hope, if you will, from that, I think. It is a little bit depressing that two eminent scholars like these guys have come to the conclusion that there are no rays of hope. But I don't think that's necessarily fair. And I would suspect that a number of you like this book as sort of a vent for your frustration, a cathartic experience, you might say. But I think you need to look beyond that and ask the question of where does it get you? If you accept it and you agree with it all, what's the next step to end it? How do you then solve this whole problem? And that is especially true for dealing with the legitimacy of the viewpoints of the people who you refer to as obstructionists. So let's try and move past that. So let me give you some viewpoints from Republican conservative eyes, which, after all, is a party roughly at parity with the Democratic Party. And I know you guys say that you wrote this from the opinion of scholars looking at a problem and analyzing the problem, but it is nonetheless the position that the partisan Democrats in Congress would I think, agree with and take, and that any Republicans who did not vote for McCain-Feingold would not agree with. So that's where I think you need to start to look. To solve it, you need to recognize it is a nation with two parties at parity. As Nate has pointed out, 10 years ago, political scientists were bemoaning the fact that there wasn't a dime's bit of difference between the parties. Now there's more than a dime's worth of difference between the parties, and we're kind of complaining about that. So there are historical trends that come along, and actually I think those historical trends are probably a ray of hope in what you see. I'm troubled in the book that it does all seem to be the Republicans' fault. You talked about the energy bill. The energy bill did have sufficient sponsors to break the filibuster. The behind-the-scenes story was that at the same time, Harry Reid was jamming up Republicans. Republicans felt they were being jammed up by Harry Reid's parliamentary Senate rules tactics and couldn't get their amendments on a whole series of bills and votes. Well, the reaction to that, as happens to a minority that's getting run over with the rules, is that they use the rules to help make their points. That's what happened in those bills. It was not one side. It does take two sides to dance, and to deal with the situation we're now in, you need to recognize that there are two sides and two parts of the problem, and you can ascribe more of the blame to Republicans, and I don't really want to defend all the bright, shining examples of my party over the past couple of years, but I do think you have to realize that there are legitimate complaints in there as we go forward. Let me say that we learned a number of things from the commission. The first was, if you're going to take on problems, you do need hard partisans from both sides. I know there have been favorable references to Republicans who are willing to compromise and to listen. You sort of sum that up with the No Labels group. I'm just going to say that that is not the way you're going to break the logjam of dysfunction. That on a very practical basis, you need to take the hardest edge partisans from both sides and get them talking about common problems. There are some issues in which I suspect you can actually get agreement that would be pretty good starting points. A number of the election law issues are among them. Campaign finance is one where there actually, I think, is more agreement between the sides than is generally given credit for. That would help to deal with some of the problems in elections and campaigning. And I think there are a number of institutional issues having to do with leadership. It is remarkable that the last three presidents have actually come to Washington with at least the rhetorical goal of trying to break down the partisan differences. Bill Clinton governed that way to an extent as governor of Arkansas. Things went a little bit off the tracks in Washington after a while. George W. Bush had a pretty solid record as governor of Texas as a Republican dealing with Democrats in the legislature. He got some things through early in his term. Then the institutions of Washington kind of ganged up on him. And certainly President Obama came trying to change the discussion in Washington, and there were reasons that didn't work as well. The point is, both sides have done it to the other. And so if you're seeking the solutions or the rays of hope, that's where I think you need to start from. And I'm afraid the book does a disservice to actually getting somewhere in a civil dialogue to get back to that. So I hope that gives a perspective. I love you guys, but I wish that finding rays of hope didn't hurt book sales on some level.
I want to turn it over to the audience for questions, but if you, I should give Norm and Tom a chance to respond. I should, as you think about what to say to your commentators, I want to recognize Susan McClatchy and the McClatchy family for both my job here, as well as the McClatchy Symposium. We had many accolades at the beginning. I just want to. So there's a ray of hope.
Yes.
Now let's keep it in that vein.
And I do want to say there probably isn't a week that goes by still when I don't get a call from a reporter from a McClatchy paper, and they're always the best kinds of calls and the best kinds of questions. So it's a real model now for what journalism used to be and isn't as much anymore. A couple of things, just first on the courts. Actually, I just finished a column on this. If you go back a couple of years ago, there was a very interesting piece in The Atlantic that looked at the number of 5-4 decisions across the entire history. And what you see is it's almost like the filibuster, actually, the number, and they go up, and they are higher in the Roberts Court as a proportion of cases than any other in history. So the partisan warfare has metastasized to the courts. And I would also say what concerns me the most about the state of campaign finance, the Wild West, is elected judges and state courts. I travel around the world, as so many of us in the room do, talking about what emerging democracies or countries struggling to find some reality can do. The rule of law and an independent judiciary are right at the top of the list everywhere. We're in danger of losing that at the state level. That's a real problem. Now, having said that, Ben, first, I want to acknowledge that there are no angels here. It's not like you have one party of heroes and one party of villains. And in our previous book, The Broken Branch, we hit Democrats pretty hard. And as we talk about the 40-year rule that Democrats had that Newt Gingrich, after 16 years of efforts, managed to break, it was a party that, having been in power for so long, grew more than a little corrupt, complacent, arrogant, and played into his hands to some degree. So we're not suggesting that the solution lies on one side. But the asymmetry that Tom talked about, I think, is undeniable, and you don't have to take our word for it. When you get Jeb Bush in the middle of the 2012 campaign saying, Ronald Reagan couldn't win a nomination in my party right now, that tells you something. Now, he might say Jeb Bush can't win a nomination in my party right now, but that's another story. Second is that I think we make fairly clear in the book, but perhaps not clearly enough, we don't want to see a Republican Party go away. We don't want to see it consigned to permanent minority status. And we fully well recognize that it's not going to be a centrist or moderate party. The old debates going back to the era of Teddy Roosevelt against William Howard Taft, a progressive wing against a conservative wing, are long gone. There is no progressive wing anymore. The old conservatives are now the new establishment, and they're up against radicals. And we want a vibrant, conservative, it's going to be conservative, plenty conservative, probably more conservative than you, problem-solving party. The problem that we see is it's not a problem-solving party anymore. And frankly, there are plenty of Republicans who did not vote for McCain-Feingold, mostly former members, I have to say, who have come to us and said, thank you for doing this. Please help us rescue the old conservative Republican problem-solving party. That's what we want, and we would be thrilled to have it. But you're in danger of losing that, and losing it for a very long time now. And when I look at an establishment, now the new theme in journalism is the establishment, the empire strikes back. The establishment fights back. Oh, look, Tom Tillis won in North Carolina. There's the establishment. Then look at what Tom Tillis has done. He's no moderate figure. He's not even a standard conservative figure. Basically, what's happening is I think we're seeing a Republican establishment that is giving in on so many grounds that is moving away from its traditional problem-solving base. Now, a couple of words on what to do about this. And I do think that, you know, we're not in a completely hopeless situation, and we don't want to move in that. We believe, because half the book is about what to do next or what not to do, we feel some urgency that we have to move forward. We've got to expand the electorate. Much of this goes outside the institutions because it's a cultural problem. We have to move beyond having a smaller sliver of the electorate that can dominate this process and pull us further apart. We disagree with you on what ought to happen on the campaign front, because what we see is an awful lot of big money that's acting as a magnet that actually is creating even further polarization. And it's one of the reasons why we like things like an open primary system, which we would combine with preference voting, that is not going to change the world and create a whole bunch of new moderate candidates, but could give some protection for incumbents who want to solve problems against an assault from those who will run against them or put in a lot of money against them if they lift their heads up out of the foxhole. We got a lot of other areas, internally and externally, where we think we can begin to inch back a little bit. And finally, I would say, we also have to get a little bit of perspective. The fact is, we've been going through an awful economic time that is going to take a while to get out of, and if you look all across the world, other political systems, including parliamentary systems, have struggled more than we have. There are very few societies now where leaders are exalted or are viewed in a very positive light. It's great in a parliamentary system when you can have a majority that gets in and can act, but what if they act stupidly over and over and over again, as so many of these countries have through the economic crisis, and continue to use austerity when it didn't make sense? So we're not alone. That doesn't offer great comfort, but we've actually muddled through a little bit better than others. There is some modest comfort to take from that. But if we're looking at solving long-term societal problems as we have a society changing in its demographic basis so much with the enormous challenges outside and inside, this level of dysfunction and the sectarianism that's beginning to take over is dangerous. And not to admit that there is a problem that's broad, but it's more on one side, takes us further away from solutions.
Quickly, yes.
Just a word, I wanted to underscore something that Ben said that I agree with, which is the parties, the partisans have to be major players in any effort to improve our politics. And I find almost all of the efforts to go around them, including no labels, certainly including the host of bipartisan commissions and nonpartisan efforts to bring people together and kumbaya, you know, are all silly. I mean, and so I believe in political parties as you do, and I've always been if you will, a regular on reform matters, and far from the sort of absolutist goo-goo agenda. But it seems to me we're crazy if we don't recognize that the parties are now implicated in a very dysfunctional system of governance. They have never been stronger by our conventional measures, but that doesn't fit well with our system. And one of them has moved itself away from any interest, that its strategic interest in gaining control exceeds any interest in trying to engage in problem solving with another party. So we're going to have two partisan battles. And so the answer in the ray of hope for me is some periods of unified party government that are longer than 2 years. And I think there'll be a willingness to further reform the Senate rules under those circumstances. And any efforts that can nudge the Republican Party into being a little more pragmatic and a little less ideological, conservative, principled, but not so down on the whole notion of compromise, and caring enough about their futures in presidential elections so that they really begin to diversify their positions in ways that we get some cross-cutting cleavages again and some possibility of resolution on some really tough issues.
I want to give you a chance to respond, but I also want to make sure the audience gets a chance here. So if you have a question, raise your hand. I will be more Phil Donahue than Jerry Springer. But I want to collect the questions because we don't have a whole lot of time, and we have a reception waiting outside. Larry, did you have a hand up there since you're closest, and then we'll...
I think you have some really interesting ideas in the second half of your book. It might be more productive, actually, to spend much of the rest of the time talking about them, because by now we really do know how bad it is. So I completely agree with you about preferential voting. I mean, the alternative vote has worked pretty well for Australia. In fact, they complain about their party system being too boring, but I think we'd take back boring if we could get it. One thing I'd like to ask you about is whether there'd be some value to trying to change the rules on presidential debates to make it possible again for a third-party candidate to enter. Right now, the current rules of the Presidential Election Debate Commission virtually make it impossible because no one's going to have the 15%. No one's going to get into the race if they're not confident that they can meet that 15% threshold in September. And so there are alternatives floating around now that would make it possible for a third candidate to enter. And this is one of many examples where you don't need the Congress to act. There's a commission on presidential debates, and there are some people on it who aren't deeply embedded in one party or the other. So what do you think of that?
I'm going to collect the questions. I should say we have one of the members of the commission.
No, I'm not on that
or advising. Yeah, who's involved? Yeah. Keep your questions as short as possible.
I'd like a link to the, I'll call it Republican proposals, and some counter to this democratically biased, you think, book, so that I can also read what directions, what are alternate proposals.
Other hands. Yeah, Adam.
You know, I wonder whether, as law students, law professors, political scientists, we're tempted to see problems as the ones we're used to dealing with, such as we're identifying institutional problems with the mechanics of politics, and those are, for the most part, what all of your recommendations deal with. I wonder, in my question to you, is whether the problem, we're actually mislocating the problem, and it's actually something that's going on in civil society. Demographic changes and the structure of the economy are changing, producing attitudes which have cleavages across the country and maybe are not shared across generations, and what your prospects are that really the way out of this is just to wait for people to die. And I mean, you know, that's a morbid way of putting it, but that's my question.
In the long run, it's true, right? One other question right over there. Can you pass that?
Sorry, I got a big voice. You gentlemen have been, you know, up on the front lines of this nasty culture. But could you speak a little bit? I have to imagine that those who are kind of embroiled in it hate it, right? I mean, I have to imagine that that's the case. I don't imagine that anybody loves making those calls to donors all the time and being on the, you know, and so, you know, is there a potential for leadership on issues like campaign finance reform or reversing these ridiculous kind of redistricting practices, or, you know, kind of taking back the system?
Was there one last hand, I thought? Yeah, bear in mind, guys, could you pass that down? Just down.
Thank you. Part of this, I wonder how much of this is to a degree structural. So you talk about the permanent campaign. So one of the interesting facts, which I'm sure all of you know, is the idea of another of the change that occurred in 1994 with the election of the Republicans taking the House, is that the size of the majority in the House has been smaller than the smallest size of the majority that the Democrats had in the previous 40 years. And so the change in the nature of majority status has a lot to do with this. And so I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Okay, well, Ben, can I start with you, so give you a right of reply, and then we'll go back to.
Norman, Jane.
Well, let me start off with the notion of hope for the Republican Party, which seems to be on people's minds to one degree or another. I want to say this about the Republican Party and problem solvers. We are where we are in Washington. If you look around the country to the 30 Republican governors, you will see more problem solving and more good solutions than you do in Washington. It's equally true of Democratic governors. So there's something that goes on in state capitals, even although they're polarized, that leads to problem solving that's not part of Washington. Maybe the media culture, maybe the way different state laws are set up, may just be because it's sort of closer and closer to problems, real problems in people's lives. But in terms of problem solvers, the Republican governors, I think, have done, by and large, an outstanding job in their states of doing that, and there are many good Democratic governors who have done that as well. I do think you see in the Republican primaries this time pretty substantial pushback to the strict Tea Party folks who won before, who I think caused you guys the most angst. Now, you can say that Tom Tillis is really far to the right and not a problem solver. The larger point that's really interesting is that he was helped not by the Republican Party of North Carolina, but by super PACs from Washington who have, by and large, decided that to be able to govern better, the leaders need more moderate, if you will, or problem-solving conservative nominees. So that's an interesting phenomenon that's taken place. If you want to talk about the overall recasting of the Republican Party, the reality is that takes place with the nominee of the party. And so you need to take a careful look at who the potential Republican candidates are. I don't know where Rand Paul fits into your notion of Tea Party conservatives, but I will tell you that the rules have inadvertently been written, I think, by the very establishment Republican National Committee that in a way that actually favors Rand Paul the most. So you may see a really interesting remaking of the Republican Party in 2016. And with that, I'll stop.
Let's hear from
Okay.
the
others. I actually think we may see a Republican nomination that comes down to Ted Cruz versus Rand Paul, with Rand Paul as the candidate of the establishment.
I promise you that will not happen.
But I would not see Rand Paul with either his foreign policy or his budget as being the kind of vibrant problem-solving Republican Party that I would want to see. But that's debatable. To answer some of the questions of third party and debates, I could make a case that the commission has been unduly restrictive, but at the same time, we argue quite strenuously against what was a strong movement that petered out in 2008 and again in 2012 to try to empower an independent candidate for president. It's part of the notion of somebody riding in on the white horse to save us. The reality of the American political system is that if you had a third-party candidate for president who could actually win some electoral votes, one, you might give additional traction to an extreme presidential candidate from one of the two parties who otherwise couldn't win, or two, you would throw the election into the House of Representatives, which is a disaster. And if that person ended up getting elected, you would have a president winning by a plurality with not a single adherent in either house, which would be its own disaster. So I'm not really enthusiastic about something like that. Having one debate where you might have a different voice, that's something we could argue about. On the civil society point, that really is the case that we're making, that you have to look towards structural ideas, but it's a cultural problem right now. And some of it's rooted in demographic changes, and some of it's rooted in race right now, and some of it is rooted in people who feel left out economically and in inequality. But a lot of it, too, is the nature of modern media and the coarsening of the culture that makes it easier to have these kinds of divisions where you view people as the enemy rather than as adversaries. And I mentioned in the class that we just had, there's a recent survey that shows that more people would be unhappy if a child of theirs married somebody from another party than from another religion. Now, that may be progress on one front, but that's not great. Just on the question of whether the members are unhappy, one of the things that distresses me is that the ones who are leaving voluntarily, the ones who are most unhappy, are the problem solvers. And we're seeing a number of them in both parties now this time around. I was just with a friend of mine, Tim Petri of Wisconsin, very conservative guy, whose whole orientation is to find conservative solutions to problems. He's hanging it up. He's a vibrant guy. He doesn't want to be there anymore because, frankly, he's vilified in his own party when he tries to find solutions, and it's not as if Democrats open their arms to him. So he's going away. And the reaction of the public, for the most part, is they're all terrible. Anybody who pops up and says, I'm not like the rest of them, gets additional traction. So we're leeching out the politicians, which is what we need. They're the problem solvers. And we're bringing in people who think that it's black and white and they can answer things. And when it's not, it just doesn't work very well. And it's part of why I think we need a much larger dialogue in the country and a conversation about what the problems are and what we can do about them, or we're not going to get very far. And fortunately, we now have forces on the outside, including foundations in the area and elsewhere, who are committed to a longer-term way of looking at this. We'll come out of it. The history of America is whenever we've had deep periods of dysfunction, it takes 10 or 15 years before you move around. The problem is 10 or 15 years right now is a long time.
Tom, do you want to have the last word? And then we will continue this conversation in the courtyard over libations.
Terrific. A couple of quick points. Varies to the small size of the majorities in Congress. Absolutely critical. That's what fuels the strategic and tribal behavior. Because majority control is truly up for grabs, it transforms the whole dynamic. It's not the only factor. When you combine that with the ideological differences, with the groups lining up on one side or the other, with the vast party networks that have such contrasting values and interests, you begin to see that. I don't know why anyone would want to be a member of Congress today. Honest to God, it's...
the big bucks.
Oh, yeah, right.
That's government bought and paid for.
Let me tell you, I suppose after they leave and get jobs as lobbyists, that's true. But it's a really terrible job, and the opportunities to do serious work on committee, to build expertise, to build coalitions, to have the capacity to be surprised by new information or arguments, it's gone. It's not around, and it's lousy, and I think, therefore, we got a real problem getting the kind of people that you'd like to come into the institution actually doing it. It's sort of irrational for them to do it. In the I suppose demographic change is our route out of all of this, but we make assumptions about the durability of present, alignments, and that assumes the Republican Party is absolutely irrational and wants to be a permanent minority. I don't believe that, and therefore I think there'll be arguments and appeals, and that's why eventually we'll get something on immigration, and we might even begin investing in infrastructure again, and we might appreciate science and the importance of support of it, I think. But I do think the demographic changes are huge, and they will force this kind of reconsideration. I mean, listen, the race religion and sort of cultural issues now are driving our parties apart, but the youngest cohort just doesn't relate to those at all, and they begin to diminish. The strongest feelings are held among the oldest voters in the electorate, so it passes out and begins to at least create a possibility. Just a word about a ban on governors as problem solvers. I think in general, governors are more problem solving than than those who come to Washington. And in general, frankly, metropolitan leaders are more problem solving than governors as well. Now, one of the reasons they can do it is because they have unified party government for the most part in states, and many of them don't face the same supermajority, or they've built supermajorities to actually get things done. And so they're producing outcomes. We don't have gridlock and inaction, but some is quite extreme. If you look carefully at Kansas or North Carolina, it's a little scary what's going on. And certainly Republicans of 10 years ago would have been uncomfortable with virtually all of the proposals that are being passed. So there is some hope, once you get in these other areas, but it's not because a lot of it is because one party's in charge and can get something done. The question is whether they produce policies that can be sustained and approved by the electorate over the long haul.
Well, thank you, and let's thank our panelists.